And he is, I think, one of the great writers of our times. He's an intellectual, he is an essayist, he's a novelist, he is a wonderful host. And Pankaj and I have been friends for a long time and sort of been having a conversation over the years, perhaps decades now, or a decade. And this will be kind of a continuation of that conversation. And what we were hoping to do was to just track our way through some of the different themes that Pankaj has talked on, historically, about our contemporary moment in the world, in Pakistan and beyond, and then to look at where we might be going. I'm going to keep Pankaj's introduction very short, but he's the author of many fantastic books, including Age of Anger. He is published everywhere. He is the recipient of incredible prizes. But above all, he is someone who has a take on what is happening today, which is informed by a unique perspective on what has come before. And a framework of analysis that I hope you'll see tonight is really quite incredible. So let me pause there and let us all give Pankaj another round of applause and welcome him to the hall.
Thanks very much, Mohsin. And I should say, what a pleasure it is to be back in Lahore. Wonderful city, and it's always delightful to be here and to catch up with old friends and to resume various conversations, including one that I've been having with Mohsin for nearly 20 years now. I think we more or less started around the same time, publishing and have been talking about a whole range of things over the years. Talking about larger patterns of history, the way it impacts our way of looking, our ways of conceiving of ourselves. And also, we were just discussing earlier today, the necessity to get away from interpretations or ideas that belong too much to the present, that are shaped entirely by either passing trends or things we read in the media, or the kind of quick analytical frames that are constructed virtually overnight. So essentially the need to broaden our particular frameworks, and that is, certainly the intention behind a lot of what I have tried to write or try to say, which is that we need to get away from this sort of tyranny of the present moment, and often discover resources, intellectual resources, ideas in the past, sometimes in the distant past.
I think that one thing which I've always experienced in reading Pankaj's books is how we move effortlessly across two different dimensions: the dimension of geography, spanning the world, and the dimension of time, going back across the centuries. Sometimes we think, living in this moment, that we are experiencing something that is unprecedented, that things today are utterly different than what came before. But I was struck, for example, in reading you, at some of the intellectuals and figures that you have explored in your writing. And I'd like to begin by asking you about somebody from this part of the world that we in Pakistan, given our peculiarly resistant notion to history, or perhaps the fact that if we were to look too closely at history, we would be terrified by what it would reveal about what is actually happening in our country. And we can recognize, to a certain extent, a kind of Hindu past. But we almost never stop to consider our Buddhist past. And you've written about the Buddha as a figure I wonder if you could just set for us the scene of the crisis that he was responding to, and the thoughts that he set in motion, echoes of which we will see continue to even now.
Well, I mean, as you say, Buddhism is in many ways such a radical set of ideas, and they were, like most religions or philosophies or the worldviews that have been civilizationally influential, they always emerged as a response to a certain crisis. That's also true in the case of Islam, definitely Christianity. But Buddhism, which, as you pointed out, the networks that helped carry Buddhism to distant parts of Asia once existed in this country. The evidence is just a few kilometers from here in the Lahore Museum. The Buddha emerging when he did in the North India was responding to what we in the present might call a very widespread existential crisis, the crisis created by the collapse of old social structures. Very broadly speaking, the emergence of the individual without the old props, the old comforts, the old assurances, the individual who finds himself or herself suddenly, dramatically alone in the wider world and cannot rely upon the older forms of revealed religion, who has to make his way, her way into the wider world, and desperately needs an ethic, a worldview, something to figure out how to lead one's particular life. So I think his particular diagnosis of what is causing this individual to suffer so much, what are the delusions that essentially people become vulnerable to when they leave this very structured life of the past. In many ways, those are the anxieties, those are the problems that many people around the world are facing today. As the forms of life they have been accustomed to, whether you're living in an industrial society facing deindustrialization suddenly, whether you are in countries which are undergoing breakneck urbanization, moving away from communities, social bonds that have defined your existence, and suddenly finding yourself alone in the wider world, again, completely helpless. So this is obviously massively simplifying these processes. There are variables, there are new aspects, there are new elements in every situation, and one must not underestimate them. But at the same time, I think it is possible to see much of human history in these broader ways as essentially, and particularly the rise of ideologies, the rise of philosophies, to responses to particular breakdowns in social equilibrium. And when you start looking at the late 19th century or early 20th century, the rise of ideologies that have shaped much of modern history, whether it's nationalism, whether it's religious or religion-tinged nationalisms of various sorts, or the Zionism or Hindu nationalism or Islamic fundamentalism, all emerging roughly around the same time, they're also responses to massive shifts, massive changes within the society and political economy of these societies.
When you look at the time of the Buddha, clearly he was a strong man, but he isn't a strong man in the sort of Putin, Erdogan, Trump, and perhaps we even have figures like that in Pakistan and India sense. It wasn't a sort of nationalist feint that the Buddha deployed to the crisis around him. There was a different kind of move that he made, a different intellectual journey, spiritual journey that he went upon. And this kind of move, as you've explored, which is that there is a kind of nationalistic impulse, a tribal impulse. One of the ways in which we have responded for thousands of years to these crises, when masculinity is in question, when society is in question, when the old ways are no longer working, is to retreat into various kinds of tribalisms. But the Buddha is quite interesting in this sense, as a figure from our part of the world who adopted a very different directional move, who was looking for something different, who decided not to engage in a nationalistic or tribalistic feint. And you chart how there are echoes of that kind of thinking and that kind of figure that proceed forward, throughout history. You've talked about the colonial period, now jumping forward a couple of thousands of years. Again, a time when people had to figure out what they were. The old systems are no longer working. The old faiths are no longer serving the purpose for some people. The idea of who and what we are is in challenge. And a number of wandering, perhaps not mystics, but wandering thinkers came at this problem in many interesting ways as you've explored. I'd love for you to tell us a bit about these people and what we can see of some of the intellectuals from our region of 100 and a bit years ago.
Well, I suppose, the first generation of what one might call anti-colonial thinkers, or people who are responding to the immense power of Western imperialism.
And sorry, just one thing there, just to make sure that we're not engaging in a shorthand that the audience isn't going to be part of, is that in a sense the Buddha is, of course, an anti-colonial thinker.
Yeah, very much an
he's a titanic kind of anti-colonial gesture against a system which he finds utterly oppressive, and sets in motion this trend. And now you're going to tell us about the more recent...
Well, because, the fundamental stress is on restraint. It's a suspicion of power. It's a suspicion, fundamentally, of desire. And that makes him a radical thinker, basically puts him in opposition to some of the most fundamental tendencies of modern civilization. And when that started to be critiqued in the late 19th century by figures from Asia, they were often echoing many of these older critiques, whether it's the first generation of Chinese thinkers who were, clearly directly influenced by sort of Buddhist tradition, or indeed a figure like Tagore in India. Their critique of modern imperialism was more than just a critique of colonialism as such. It was a critique of these tendencies of expansionism, of growth at all costs, and we're now seeing the environmental devastation that has caused, and it's right in front of our eyes. But it's important to remember that many people back then were already pointing to the catastrophic effects of assuming that this kind of industrial growth, economic growth, transforming entire societies into essentially quasi-European American consumers is going to have a devastating effect. So the people who started to emerge in the late 19th century, all across, right from Turkey onwards, right up to Japan, they were basically saying not only is this political regime that has been imposed upon us degrading and demeaning
by the colonizing
by the colonizer, there is something fundamentally flawed and destructive about the way of thinking behind these imperialistic structures, and that we would put ourselves in great peril if we adopted these techniques without really critically examining them, whether it's industrialization or the nation state, something like the nation state, which essentially is a very poor fit for our incredibly heterogeneous communities. So they critique at very different sort of levels of this particular civilization, which is too dependent on the seemingly endless human capacity for expansion, for the generation, the multiplication of human desires. And that I find, in many ways much more interesting than the later anti-colonial thinkers who are basically saying we are embarked upon a race with the modern West and we better catch up with it.
Yes.
Using the techniques of the modern West.
And so it's worth just pausing for a moment on this thing. And so you're talking about the notion that a century ago or a century and a bit ago, the leading intellectuals, some of the leading intellectuals of colonized Asia were thinking and going around talking about the idea that, that the mode of thought of the colonizing power cannot be the answer. In other words, growth at all costs, nationalism, tribalism, division, this kind of hierarchy. That instead, it was not simply a project of beating the colonizer at the colonizer's own game, but inventing a radically more just, more inclusive, and superior mode of human existence. What happened to that conversation? Where did it go?
I think it fell victim to the exigencies, the urgencies of survival. Survival in a dog-eat world of international relations. I mean, you think about the context in which our respective countries came into being, the end of the most destructive war the world has ever seen, and then the starting of the Cold War. Again, a very destructive nuclear standoff, and let's not remember the Cold War was experienced as devastating hot wars by large numbers of people on this earth. And then the need to consolidate what you've got, what you've managed to get at that point. And this is true for many, many countries in Asia and Africa, true for China. If you look at the early writings of people like Nehru, even Mao, they're all talking about a federation. They're talking about, their political vision is a very generous one. They're not really thinking of nationalism. They're not thinking of the nation state.
Tell us a little bit about this, because we in Pakistan, we are we are very close to and very fond of China, and we tend to know pretty close to nothing about China, which is perhaps why we like China so much. Tell us a little bit about what was Mao's vision for Asia? We've heard of, the Cultural Revolution. We've heard of mass starvation, and we've heard of, the later change. But to the extent that Mao had a vision for what Asia should look like, and by extension the world, because Asia is, in a sense, most of the world in terms of population, what was it? What was being offered? Because what happened?
Well, I think Mao is a very interesting case because we see him almost entirely through his atrocities and disasters after he became the chairman. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the famine he inflicted. So we tend to think of him as a kind of monstrous figure. And in many ways he was a kind of megalomaniac. But if you look at his early years, he's very much a thinker, reflecting on various political possibilities. And let's not forget that Chinese nationalism was informed by all kinds of different intellectual currents. So many Chinese intellectuals received their training in Japan, where they were exposed to a wide variety of thought. They were also talking to people from India, they were talking to people from Burma, from Vietnam, not to mention the Japanese, they were talking to the Russians. A conversation
which is basically non-existent today.
Completely non-existent.
I mean, it's quite incredible to think that if we go back in Asian history 50 or 100 years, there's a vibrant pan-Asian conversation among intellectuals. I mean, how many great Chinese intellectuals, for example, are sitting on the stage of the Lahore Literary Festival?
I mean, that is something we have to recover now.
We have to recover it, absolutely. Yeah. But lacking such figures, we're going to tap your knowledge, and you'll have to step in and be the Chinese intellectuals for us tonight. So, I mean, to make this concrete, what kind of Asia would Mao have liked to see? What did he want us to be like?
Well, I think something more in the nature of a federation, because obviously these particular experiences of meeting various people from different parts of the world, not just him, but many other people alongside him, would have made them more predisposed to the idea of broader solidarities than just the nation state. Also the realization, the great, the long march.
Can I ask you one question on that, on the broader solidarities? Because, we're thinking about Asia, and, what is Asia? Is that broader solidarity among Asian peoples of that time, was that based on a kind of shared anti-colonial struggle? Or was it based on some sense of Asian cultural, political, religious identity, other than this historical similarity? What was the underpinning of this?
I think it was both.
Right.
It was both. It was definitely the shared experience of oppression, the shared experience of being treated as essentially inferior peoples by Westerners. But it was also an attempt to ground a critique of the modern West in Asian traditions and philosophies. To say that, look, we have had different ways of governing, we've had different political institutions, we've had different ways of understanding a human being and its place in the larger world, its responsibilities and duties. We don't have to subscribe to these very narrow notions emerging from the modern West of what an individual should be, how much they should consume, what kind of nation state should they belong to, what kind of citizen should they be. So all these ideas were up in the air at that time. People, there were actively Chinese intellectuals looking into the history of Buddhism, for instance, and deriving different notions of what a human being is, an unstable compound. So this notion that the individual, the Western notion, an individual is someone who knows or his or her self-interest and pursues it, is being complicated at that very moment and saying, actually, the human being is a pretty unstable compound. This notion that he or she knows their self-interest is a rather fanciful one.
Or that the self even exists.
Or even the self.
Because, what's very interesting about this is that, you see, we are very familiar, many of us, with a kind of Western intellectual tradition that tells us that there's a self. Each of us has a self. And this self wants things. And the self getting what it wants is really one of the main objectives of civilization. And that if we were to give the self what it wants, or harness the self to some greater purpose, in this way we can achieve the various end states, be that ascent to heaven, place in Trump Tower, whatever our dream of the future is a kind of self-fulfilling dream. And yet at the same time, we find this tension and these various strands, not just in Asia, but also very strongly in Asia, that begin to suggest things that perhaps there is no self. Here in Pakistan, we are familiar perhaps most with the Sufi version of this strand, where the notion of the relationship between the human and the divine beloved is one where that relationship begins to collapse, where it's impossible for the moth to distinguish itself from the flame of the candle, and a kind of merger occurs. And of course, there are similar things in Hindu thought, in Christian, Jewish mysticism, but especially in Buddhism, where the idea of there not being a self is quite central. And so there was this moment, as you're describing, when Asia was perhaps thinking it might, or people in Asia were beginning to think that they might conceive of a different kind of Asia, one not founded on rampant self-interest, but upon the idea that there's a kind of falseness to that quest. And yet we look at where we are today and something clearly went wrong. Why are we not living in this federated Asia which has transcended the self-interested quest of the colonizing powers?
Before we get into that, something you just said reminded me, which is that this critique of this rational self, which is at the basis of so many Western ideas and assumptions, that then gets critiqued very strongly after the First World War in Europe.
Yes.
And it's interesting to think that so many of these European thinkers, Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, T.S. Eliot, very explicitly, are drawing upon Asian traditions.
Yes.
In articulating this critique of this civilization which had promised us progress and had brought us mass slaughter in the very heart of civilization. So in many ways, these anti-colonial thinkers, and they found themselves vindicated when they actually witness some of the violence of the First World War. These perfectly civilized nations turning upon each other. Nobody knows how to turn off these engines of mass slaughter. And this notion that individuals are rational and our societies are rationally governed, they all fall to pieces. So there's massive intellectual crisis to which artistic modernism is a response. We know that. I mean, Rilke and others, so many names that come to mind are responding to that. And yet, in many ways that idea has triumphed again, especially in the last 2-3 decades, the idea of the autonomous, self-seeking, all-consuming individual.
Yeah, and to pause for a moment on this point you just made. So there was a moment around, in between the First and Second World War and immediately thereafter, for example, a modernist moment in Western literature and the arts, where a kind of formal experimentation was going on. We were seeing art that began to say, what is a novel? What is a painting? What are these things? Can a toilet be a work of art? Need a novel say anything? And the sort of collapse, the formal collapse of art, which we began to see as one impulse in the West, which is also in its sense, if you think of the form of the art as the kind of self of the art, that there is a book, that there is a painting, these notions begin to tumble. So it's not simply that in Asia there's a questioning going on, but elsewhere. And yet, despite this questioning that was happening, as we move forward then from Mao closer to our current moment and try to track why it is that we are still in crisis, a very similar crisis to what has been the case for 100 years, and then to talk specifically about the various countries and situations in the world today. Tell us a little bit about what happened then in those intervening decades between the moment of where we are now.
Yeah. One can only paint a very broad picture as a response to that question. But I think if you think about the early 20th century as a series of devastating crises, the First World War, then a very serious economic crisis affecting large parts of the world, not just the West and the United States. Then you have many unresolved questions of the First World War. They rear up again. Then you have the Second World War. Decolonization starts as a result of the First World War. The empires of the past are too exhausted really to hold on to their territories, so they start giving the opportunity of self-determination to many peoples around the world. But then the Cold War starts.
Yeah.
And I feel like we haven't really thought at length about what the Cold War did to these earlier modes of thinking and questioning. The Cold War was a period of profound intellectual and artistic regression. I think it's becoming clear. Not to mention geopolitical regression as well, because what it did, it froze everything. Many ideas were simply deemed illegitimate or seemed too dangerous to experiment with. Suddenly we were in blocks. Suddenly we were banding together under these various pacts, and essentially all belonging to this very dangerous nuclear standoff. And that, I think the larger impact of that, I feel like it's yet to be understood. We are still only emerging. The Cold War has finally ended. I think it only ended a few years ago. With the arrival of Trump, we embarked on a new phase in modern history. And now that it's ending,
yes.
we are actually even able to ask these questions, like what really happened?
Well, and who won?
Who won? Exactly. It seemed like everyone lost.
Well, yeah. I mean, it seemed for a moment that, of course, America won, and then the Soviet Union lost, and then we saw the most recent election, and it becomes very complicated as to who won the Cold War.
It was definitely a lose-lose proposition.
Yeah.
And I think we really have to kind of, and that's why I keep saying that we have to kind of excavate these older forms of thinking that were obscured for so long by this whole process. And also, the very real imperatives, whether you were in India or Pakistan or in Germany or France, to rebuild these war-shattered, war-ravaged economies. These places, so many of these places, you think about China, we don't think of China in that context, but it had a horrific civil war. And then the Japanese invasion, Second World War, was fought there. And it was
and then a bit more civil war afterwards.
Exactly, more civil war. So it was an utterly devastated country. So nation building became this new norm. Nation building brought in its train a whole ways of very constricted thinking about all kinds of things, political possibilities, artistic possibilities. So experimentation carried on, but without that kind of radical edge it had in the 20s and 30s.
I mean, for a moment there, around the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, it seemed that perhaps, at least the narrative was being told, we were all converging on a kind of web-connected, free trading, free idea exchanging, although of course people would not be allowed to move, but ideas and services and goods would move, and everyone would trade, and the whole thing would become a kind of sort of Clinton-Blair world. We were derailed from that vision, if that vision was ever a realistic one. And of course, the events of September 11, 2001, the terrorist attacks of that, and then the subsequent wars, we look at as a marker of how we once again shifted into this pattern of conflict. But that marker comes across deeper gaps that are opening up. We once again are finding ourselves, it seems, living in a world where there is a real crisis of what we are and what we should be. How do you explain the almost universal appearance of this crisis? That India has a prime minister who boasts about his chest size, that Russia has a leader who is a judo expert and posts, topless, selfies, that Pakistan has a prime minister who was the most famous cricketer we've produced and a victorious cricket champion, an international, sex symbol in the magazines. Trump, we all know, played his part in the dalliances that he's had. What is up with this hyper, seemingly virile man, and the universality of the search for figures like this everywhere? Not to say that they are all the same. I don't think that Imran Khan and Trump and Modi are the same, but the desire for the powerful man seems universal at the moment.
Well, I suppose, it is, I'm fascinated by this conjuncture and trying to think about it in different ways, But one angle that I've started to explore recently is we should look at some of this at least as a desperate, often frustrated, largely frustrated search for a kind of power largely defined in masculine terms. And that, I've been thinking about writing a book around this subject, a short one, because a similar conjuncture can be seen in the late 19th century, when almost all the ideologies that we are familiar with today started to emerge, whether it's Zionism or Hindu nationalism or Buddhist nationalism. Nationalism in general became a powerful force around that time, and it premised around the idea of a strong body politic. and a strong nation.
With strong bodies.
Definitely strong bodies.
Yeah.
And the fear of feminization. So you have people from all over the world simultaneously expressing these anxieties and fears, whether it's Vivekanand from India, Anagarika Dharampal in Sri Lanka, is a very crucial figure in the making of Buddhist nationalism. The early Zionists, the founders of Zionism, are obsessed with this notion that we become weak and effeminate, that we need to toughen up. And that toughening up takes all kinds of forms, including physical exercise. Likewise, Vivekananda saying the Hindus have become too weak, we need to develop these muscles that
this is the late 19th century we're talking about.
This is the late 19th century we are talking about.
And what prompted this? Because, I mean, once again, we see this desire for the strong man. But this initial moment, global moment of desiring male strength, what caused it to come into existence in the 19th century?
I think it is definitely rooted in an experience that tells you that you're extremely weak, that you're extremely powerless, and it's true in both these conjunctures. In the case of the 19th century, I mean, looking at it from different perspectives, if you're looking at it from the perspective of someone like Iqbal, for instance, who's also very invested in this rhetoric of Nietzscheanism, of Superman. If you look at it from his perspective...
Iqbal, who's our national poet, in a sense.
Exactly. You're looking at essentially a highly educated person and many other persons like him who are regarded as inferior, physically inferior, intellectually inferior, who are essentially subject to a racist regime, which is the British colonial regime in this country, and also when you go to Europe, you collide with the realities of that there as well. Likewise, there are many people in India who are feeling the same, in Sri Lanka, the educated elites who themselves belong to the upper castes or upper classes within their respective countries, and yet find themselves humiliated by these white people. So their desire for manly strength and their fear of weakness that they associate with women and womanliness comes out of this particular experience. In the case of many people in Western Europe and America...
Because you were saying that, for example, in the West, this late 19th century, the period is the period where bodybuilding is born, where competitive sports are born, where all these athletic practices, whereby in those days mostly men, would prove their maleness to one another in the contemporary form, football, cricket, weightlifting, etc., are all coming to the fore. And they're not experiencing the colonization that would cause somebody, for example, in Pakistan or India at that time, to feel erased, their masculinity erased. They're experiencing something else that's erasing their masculinity.
Definitely. I mean, there are some countries within Europe which still feel themselves to be the receiving end, and particularly the Jewish minorities in Eastern Europe and what is now Russia. They felt themselves, essentially their dignity consistent. So they were invested in that rhetoric from somewhat sort of, the perspective of the colonized.
Yep.
And the Germans feeling themselves constantly condescended to by the British and the French. The Germans were heavily invested in bodybuilding, gymnastics. I mean, so many things they kind of literally invented.
Yeah.
Including modern yoga. I mean, this is one of their contributions.
I mean, just reading Nietzsche is sort of like reading the fitness manual of philosophy. It's all about the sort of Superman.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But in the United States and in Britain, which also plays home at this point to a movement for hyper-masculinity, and there are many manifestations of that, the Boy Scout movement, the new imperialism, which is more jingoistic, which is harsher. Some of Churchill's more demented, deranged comments emerge in this, come out of this particular period. Theodore Roosevelt in the United States, having subdued, conquered Native Americans and various other American minorities. There are no more frontiers, there are more borders. So now we have to indulge in overseas expansion. So, again, sort of
Philippines, Cuba.
Exactly, yeah. And he's talking openly about emasculated men, how we need to discover this sort of manly strength that we are losing. And one of the reasons why this fear is so potent and speaks to many people is because for the first time many people are engaged in industrial production and in which are becoming more and more streamlined. So you're doing these repetitive tasks and feeling utterly degraded by them. And this idea of bodily strength becomes more important. And this is also, we are also talking about secularized societies. So the movement,
and a sense of threat in this context, right? That you basically in these factories, what we're encountering in the 1900s, in the 19th century, 1800s, is the steam engine. And suddenly we have machines that are more powerful than humans, that can run faster as a train does, that can lift more like an industrial shovel does. And so we are coming face to face with creations, human creations, that are stronger than we are. And the existence of the repeating rifle, which allows a weakling to shoot down a bodybuilder. Exactly. And in this moment of technological change, and as you say, the end of conquest, what do you conquer now? The whole world has been conquered and or colonized. You can just trade your colonies with each other. This crisis in the supposedly non-colonized countries is in full bloom, just as it is in places like India and Pakistan.
Exactly. Very much. I mean, I think, and if you try and connect that moment to today, you'll find some of the forces that were unleashed back in the late 19th century have re-emerged in a kind of almost a monstrous form. They're much more global in scope. I mean, the forces of automation, the feeling that decisions are being taken affecting your lives in the profoundest way, thousands of miles away by unknown, obscure people, the feelings of powerlessness, weakness, humiliation they engender lead many people to the conclusion that they need to have buffed up bodies.
Yep.
That they need to develop individually this strength, not so much inner strength, but bodily strength.
Yeah.
So the cult of fitness, for instance, which is swept across
Look
India.
at the abs and pecs of a Bollywood star today.
Yeah.
And consider that there's no such thing as the abs and pecs of a Bollywood star.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at early Amitabh Bachchan films,
Yes.
he's a sort of, lanky guy.
Yeah. With no pecs
thin.
to speak of,
No
really.
pecs to show off.
No.
But there's hardly a Bollywood star who has his shirt on these days.
No.
You know?
And it's interesting because, although we would like to think that the push-up has become more effective in the intervening 30 years, it seems undeniable that this transformation that we've seen in the physique of the Bollywood star is a human growth hormone and steroid-ridden transformation, just as it was for the Hollywood star in the 1980s. Steve McQueen, didn't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Absolutely.
And the birth of the 80s action star in America, this roided-up, uber muscle man figure, who was full of the, hormones of 100 men, perhaps 1,000 men,
Exactly.
and had the pecs and abs to match.
And that's interesting, Mohsin, that, you remind me that trend, Rambo and Schwarzenegger, that emerges exactly at the time that American power is in deep crisis, goes into crisis. I mean, today
After
we are seeing
Vietnam.
the culmination of that.
Yeah.
You have the oil crisis, these darkies basically start to dictate world oil prices, sending Western economies into a tailspin in the 70s, which coincides with the withdrawal from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon.
Yep.
So one humiliation after another, and these heroes emerge to console the kind of white supremacist
Rambo,
Rambo,
who was injected a full battalion's worth of testosterone into his buttocks and become the Uberman.
Exactly.
That figure emerges at this crisis.
Absolutely.
And is now emerging, of course, in South Asia in a similar time of crisis.
in a similar time of crisis.
And when you think of this kind of Uberman, and you look at, you were speaking before of how the conquest of the world was complete and colonization, etc. Why today are we once again in this crisis of masculinity? Because it's a different technological moment. It's a different political moment. What is giving rise in the world today to this crisis? Why do we feel this? And in fact, just before you answer that, I'd love you to tell us a little bit about that answer generally, but then also tell us a little bit about what's happening, for example, in India and America as two contrasts in this phenomenon.
I feel that these crises recur and never leave us because they never feel powerful enough. I mean, this was Buddha's insight early on, that this whole pursuit is doomed. But if that becomes the basis of modern civilization, continuous growth of strength, both of individuals and of collectivities, then those crises become a form of pathology that accompany us wherever we go in different parts of the world. Yeah. So I feel this is something. This crisis is kind of hardwired into modern civilization, and the way it conceives of individuals, power, the role of power, often confusing power with dominance over others, and dominance over others is always going to be resisted.
Yes. And it's in a sense where, I mean, it's the insight of the Asian intellectuals we were talking about before, which is that if this idea of supremacy is the objective, then somebody else must be colonized. And surely that cannot be the future. But speaking now of South Asia, so Pakistan, after the humiliation of 1971, has its own, in a sense, Vietnam moment. And we see in Pakistan in the 1980s the rise of our dictator General Zia-ul-Haq, of a politicized Islamization, enforced Islamization campaign, which is out of this moment of sort of humiliation that is now being, in a sense, similar to what America went through. In India, for those of us who live in Pakistan, what's happening today, it looks in some senses oddly familiar. That it seems like, that Modi has concluded that given the incredible success of this experiment in Pakistan, he must enact something quite similar over there, which is, I think, baffling to anybody who lives in Pakistan as to why you would want to do this. But why is it happening there? What's going on?
Well, I mean, one of the dismal, depressing things about history is the way it often, if not repeat itself, certainly starts to rhyme. And what we see in India today, again, is something we've seen in various different national contexts, which is a search for superpowerdom, not just ordinary power, but very large, extensive power to not just be able to conduct, which is a big enough achievement in itself, your own particular policies, your national policies, without interference from others, but the ability to dominate the region, not just the region, but a large part of the globe. And that is a doomed fantasy. Not even China can aspire to that kind of power anymore. Those days are over for practically every country, including the United States.
Such large national pecs are Absolutely. Beyond even steroid.
Even growth hormones won't help.
But this fantasy of kind of regional hegemony, which seems to now have taken root quite strongly in India, or are we seeing the rise of resistance to this phenomenon?
Would like to see themselves, exactly. So I think any representation of India that claims to be complete or claims to be speaking for nearly 1.4 billion people is a false construct, because India is an incredibly diverse place, and there are many, many political tendencies, many different kinds of aspirations and desires, and for most people, their fundamental desire is shared by people in every part of the world, which is a desire for stability, security, a better future for their children.
What's been called a good enough life.
A good enough
not
life.
The best life.
Exactly.
Not number one. I once had an Italian friend who said the difference between Americans and Italians is 5 minutes left. The difference between Italians and Americans is Americans say, we're number one, and Italians say, we're number 6, and we love being number 6. Number 6 is pretty good. There's 200 countries. And so I think that this notion of what might be good enough is very interesting. We've got 5 minutes left, and there's so much more we can talk about, and I encourage people to grab Pankaj and talk to him after this. But I'd like to look now into the future for 5 minutes. And where might we go? How do we find our way out of these nationalist traps, jobs that historically have been done by men? The machines that gave birth to the previous crisis of masculinity aren't going away. They are intensifying. What is our way out of this? How do we in Pakistan, India, Trump's America, Brexit Britain, how do we get out of this trap? What do we look to and where do we go?
Well, I think, speaking as citizens or people with affiliations and loyalties in this part of the world, I think, and speaking also as writers, I feel the most urgent task for at least my community is a kind of intellectual decolonization. We achieved political version of it many years ago. But I think we've remained trapped within certain discourses of essentially industrialization, urbanization, without really thinking through the consequences, without ever thinking, are these feasible for a large, populous countries, whether we need to think about something. To give you a very small example, industrialization in India, so much of Indian growth is premised upon industrial expansion. So many of Indian desires for strength are premised on that. Now we know that India will not be an industrial power in the way it wants to be. It will get somewhere else, and other countries have taken lead in certain very crucial areas. So what do you do? How do you create employment for the millions of people entering the workforce every year? You have to come up with creative solutions. But you won't if you continue to believe in this fantasy that India is going to be an industrial superpower. All the facts tell us that it won't happen. And in order to think creatively of a policy that takes us out of this, you first have to start getting rid of the ideas and ideologies that have got us into this impasse. So when I think about the future, I think about the urgent task is to really clear the backlog, this immense backlog of what Pathology in another context called derivative discourses. Discourses derived from the experience of imperialist powers, essentially, who managed to acquire territory, conquer people around the world, appropriate their resources, bring together all kinds of different strengths to constitute essentially imperialist nations, and then impose their ideas upon the rest of us. I think we've been too foolish, too reckless to embrace these ideas without questioning the experience from which they emerge, and thinking that we can replicate that experience.
Yeah. And to impose them upon our own quote-unquote minority populations, for example, as we've done horrifically in Pakistan, in India, pretty much everywhere. I think we are unfortunately out of time. The last thing I will say, just as we end tonight's conversation, and hopefully you'll be back and this will be an ongoing feature, is that part of this challenging of mythology, one of the most powerful myths we have is of the notion of a necessary Indo-Pak conflict. At the moment, we see the two countries once again engaged in heightened rhetoric. This is a myth in which we can choose not to believe. We may decide that we don't think that Indo-Pak conflict is a necessary, desirable, inevitable, productive thing. And to that extent, I think we've been very fortunate to have somebody like you, an Indian and international writer, on stage with us here in Lahore. And I hope that as you stay here and continue your conversations, that some of these myths that we belong to different tribes that must necessarily be in conflict can be challenged, and we can begin to together imagine what might be a better way of being a Pakistan, of being an India, of being a South Asia, being an Asia, or indeed being a world. Pankaj, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much, Mohsin.